Hi there fabric jugglers, it's Babs here from MyFieryPhoenix, and what I'm going to be taking you through today is a very miniature version of a quilt. So I'll be taking you through creating the quilt sandwich, how to baste it, how to actually quilt it so that you get this lovely effect with the raised portions and the quilting, sewing, stitching going through all three layers of the quilt sandwich. And I will also show you how to use binding. This is pre-made bias binding, and I'll show you how to go around using your sewing machine to create the bias binding. Full written series of tutorials, which I will link to in the description below, which will take you through all of this process for not just pinning the fabric, but also other options like spraying or actually tacking the quilt sandwich in place. So the first thing that we need to do is explain what the three parts are for a quilt sandwich. And in this case we have the base layer, and you need to have the right side of the fabric facing down. You have the wadding, which is what gives you the padded effect in between the two outer layers. And then you have the top layer, the quilt top, if you'd actually created it in quilt in patchwork. And in this case I'm not using patchwork, I'm simply using a pre-printed fabric, just because it keeps it simple for this little miniature demonstration. And what you should also see is that the quilt top is the smallest of the three pieces, and then everything gets slightly larger as you go through the three layers of the sandwich. This is so that as you sew, you don't actually have any twisting or pulling where you end up with different parts of the quilt not actually having the padding or the relevant backing or front pieces in the correct place. I've got another tutorial that shows you some of the common mistakes that you make when quilting, and that includes this slipping effect. So I'll put a link to that on screen. If you have a look up in this corner, I believe, then there'll be a little eye which will take you through to that other tutorial. The first thing we need to do to move on with our quilt sandwich is to actually pin this in place. So I've already pinned at the very outer edges the wadding to the back piece of fabric, and what I'm now going to do is pin my top piece in place, trying to find pins that don't actually have horrendous bends in them. Don't pin everywhere, because you need to have space to sew in between the actual quilting lines. And if you're doing this on a very large quilt, there'll be lots of crawling around on probably your living room floor, where you're having to work with a double king or single size quilt fabric piece. So don't be afraid to crawl around on the floor if that is what is needed. Now in this case I'm going to be trying to replicate this diagonal diamond pattern, which means that I need to allow space for me to sew through at an angle and then back through at the other angle. And as we work through, I'll be removing the pins, which is why these outer pins are so important to keep the three layers aligned correctly. But I'll go grab the sewing machine and show you how we move on to the next quilting step. We have our walking foot already in place, and if you're unsure how to go about attaching a walking foot to your sewing machine, I do have a tutorial on that, which I will put a link to. Again, take a look up in the top right corner and you'll see a little eye, and that will take you through there. Now this process is incredibly simple. It may feel complex, it may look scary, but it really isn't. It's very simple to follow through, especially as the pattern that I'm using is simply straight lines. So I shall just switch on the sewing machine. I need to replace the light bulb in mine, so that'll probably be another tutorial for a future day. And we're just going to start very gently. Never ever push or force the fabric through the sewing machine. Always let the feed do the job. You don't need to worry about the reversing a stitch to start and end, as everything is going to be bound off, so that will keep your ends from fraying. So you pick your angle and you simply start to sew. Now in between each level, you can simply remove, snip and start over. And you'll see that on the reverse you have the stitching, on the front you have the stitching. Now when you go for your second row, you do need to be aware to keep the fabric taut, so that you're not going to end up with lumps and bumps like this. You need to just keep that steady, and then sew on through. And there we have 2 rows. Now what I'll do is sew on without talking, so that you don't have to watch me sew in real time, and then I'll walk you through going in the opposite direction. And obviously I'll be removing pins as I go, so that I don't actually sew through the metal of the pins. So now, as you can see, we've got the quilting all in one direction, and what I'm going to do is flip it and go in the opposite direction. Now, as a guide, to help me keep my diamonds reasonably structured, I will be starting and finishing close to the angle of the sewing from the previous direction. So you can see that we've already done 2 that are fairly in alignment. Now this one's slightly fatter, but that's no problem, we'll still come down from that angle. And there you can see that's working out quite nicely. So again, I'll just go through, finish the rest of this quilting, and then I'll move on to binding one side for you. So here we have our 3 panels, and you're going to need a quilting ruler and a rotary cutter for this next step, which is simply to trim off all of this excess nastiness, so that you have a nice neat square or rectangular panel. So I'm just going to quickly run through that process. And it really is as simple as it sounds, which is that you line everything up with the top sheet, and then you cut through everything so that you have just one single layer with none of this excess. There we go. It can be a bit tricky if you're cutting when you're cutting through so many layers, especially when one of them's satin. And then get rid of your excess rubbish, and there you have a nice clean line for the top of your quilting piece. So I shall go around the rest, and once I have all of the rest neatened up, I will then come back and show you how to bind the top. The way we're going to be attaching our binding is to start off on the reverse, and then we're going to fold and flip and then sew it on the front side, so that we have our best stitching on the front and we're not going to see the stitching on the reverse. As I've previously said, I am using some pre-made satin, and I'm actually going to trim away this first piece because I don't see any reason in starting my quilting with a seam. Not that it's particularly obvious from the outside, but it just means that my starting point is going to lay down more neatly if I trim away that seam. So I shall just remove that, not that wasteful, and then we can begin. So what I'm going to do is, having changed from my walking foot back to my standard foot, I will desperately try not to sneeze. But what I'm going to do is actually pin in place the binding. So I've opened it up with the fold, and I'm going to align that edge along the edge of my quilting. Just grab some pins. I wouldn't normally use pins, but I'm sewing satin to satin, which is not necessarily the smartest of moves, but it will look beautiful when it's finished. And I'm also leaving a slight overhang over the edge here, so that if there's any movement, that is all going to be managed, and I'll have allowed for that. So I'm not going to stretch the binding, because obviously it's bias binding, not straight edge binding, which means that there's a lot of stretch and play in it, so I don't particularly want to stretch it out. For the flat edges, you wouldn't need to use bias binding, but as my project is also going to incorporate curves, I'm using bias binding. If your quilt does not have any curves, then you do not need to add in bias binding. You can use simple straight of grain binding. If you're not sure how to make straight of grain binding, I have a tutorial on that, and I have again more written instructions on that process. All sorts of links in the description below that may be useful for you in this particular mini tutorial. So we've got our quilting, and we now have our binding actually added. Now I'm not going to change out the colours. I'm quite happy to use blue and have my blue stitching showing on my burgundy or aubergine binding. So simply slide this in, and I'm going to change my stitch length to a 3. While I was actually quilting, I had my stitch length at a 4, and I'm simply going to follow the line of the fold from the actual binding piece. Making sure that if you pause to remove your pins as you go, the needle is always in the down position. You really don't want the needle to be jumping around as you're doing this. It's a nice clean straight line, and now I've made the mistake of leaving the needle up. That should always be down. If it's down, there's no risk of any of the fabric moving underneath the needle as you pull the pin out. So there we have simply sewn off the end, because for this particular project I'm going to trim that away. All I'm going to be doing is binding across the top there. So I'll just move the sewing machine out of the way so you can actually see what I'm talking about here. So now that we've sewn along that initial fold line, we can then lift this up, over and round, which means we can then either sew by hand back along this stitch line, or we can pin it in place, and we can sew by machine. So what I'm going to do is trim possibly just a smidgen off of here, and then actually I don't think I need to trim it off. If you feel this is too fat here, you can always trim this down. I'll trim a little bit. It doesn't need it that end, but this end it does slightly. So I'll just trim that away. which then just means I have less quilt to bind around. So we can move that out. Make sure we've actually cut through all the layers. There we are. And now we can bind around that far more easily. So, moving back to the sewing machine. You can choose to have a plain stitch or a fancy stitch. It's entirely up to you. And again, what I'm going to do is actually pin this in place so that I can see what I am doing rather than messing around worrying about whether everything is actually lining up as I need it to do. If I've pinned it in place, I know that it's all lining up nicely. And there we are. Okay, so here we have the whole thing pinned in place. And I'm making sure that the pins are pointing towards the foot, because that makes it easy for me to pull them out as I am sewing. So, sliding this under the presser foot, drop that down, and you want to try and sew quite close to the edge of the binding. So you want that to be about 1/8 of an inch away. I started off manually so that I could actually see that it's lining up as I want, and then I put a little bit of tension on to try and keep everything nice and even and straight, and then I start to sew. Now what I've got here, I don't know whether you can see it or not, is a slight curl in the edge of the binding where it's caught on the left piece of the foot. So I simply make sure the needle is down, lift the foot and then lower the foot. That's all I need to do, and that's then flattened out that binding edge. So I can continue on. Removing my last pin and sew to the end. And then what we have here, hopefully you can see it by using the blue thread on the aubergine binding, is that we have a nice neat finish to the front. Might be a little bit wobbly here and there, but this is quilting. This is not perfection. And we then have a nice neat line along the back. So this is how you then complete from your quilt sandwich through the actual quilting process and the binding.